Joseph Whitehorse's weathered hand gripped the radio as his heart hammered against his ribs, then suddenly stopped mid-transmission to Mary Thunderheart. The device slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the pine needle carpet of Specimen Ridge Trail. What the search and rescue team found 8 hours later defied every instinct they'd been trained to trust. Mary's binoculars trembled as she focused on the clearing below. 6 massive grizzly bears forming a perfect protective circle around Joe's unconscious body. The largest female, scarred and ancient, had positioned herself directly over him like a living shield. Her breath created small clouds in the morning air as she maintained her vigil. "Sweet Jesus," whispered Rookie Ranger Tom Blackfoot, his voice cracking. "They're not attacking him. They're guarding him." The scene before them rewrote everything wildlife experts believed about predator behavior. Yet the tender way the mother bear's massive paw rested near Joe's head spoke of recognition, of memory, of something deeper than instinct. "Move in slowly," Mary commanded, though her heart thundered with questions that had no answers. How had Joe survived the night among North America's most dangerous predators? And why did it look like they were protecting him? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The morning sun filtered through the towering pines of Yellowstone National Park as Joseph Joe Whitehorse pulled his weathered pickup truck into the ranger station parking lot. At 63, his Cherokee and Lakota heritage showed in the deep lines around his dark eyes and the silver-streaked braids that hung past his shoulders. Every morning for the past 15 years, he'd made the same ritual. 2 cups of coffee, black, one for himself, and one that would sit untouched on the kitchen counter until evening. "When you get to my age, every sunrise is a blessing," Joe often told the photograph of his daughter Emily that sat beside his badge on the dashboard. She'd been 25 when the improvised explosive device took her life in Afghanistan 8 years ago. Before that, he'd lost his wife Sarah during childbirth, leaving him to raise Emily alone until the military claimed her too. The cabin where Joe lived sat on the edge of the park boundary, surrounded by wilderness that had become more family to him than the empty rooms inside. His neighbors were the elk that grazed in his backyard and the ravens that called from the ancient Douglas firs. Some folks in town whispered that old Joe had gone a bit strange since Emily's death, talking to animals and spending more time in the forest than with people. Mary Thunderheart knew better. As the lead search and rescue coordinator for the park, she'd watched Joe transform from a gregarious ranger who loved telling stories around the fire to a man who seemed to carry the weight of the mountains on his shoulders. Her grandfather, a Lakota medicine man, had once told her that Joe possessed the old gift, the ability to speak the language that all living things understood before humans forgot how to listen. "My daddy used to say, 'Son, sometimes the best family is the one you choose,'" Joe would mutter to himself as he prepared for his daily patrols. But choosing required options, and Joe's world had grown smaller with each loss until it consisted mainly of marked trails, incident reports, and the ghost of conversations with a daughter who would never answer back. 300 miles away in Missoula, Dr. William Blackstone reviewed the quarterly reports from his legitimate Wildlife Research Foundation while his real business, a pharmaceutical empire built on extracting rare compounds from endangered species, operated in shadows. His son Michael had been killed by a grizzly bear 20 years ago during a camping trip, an event that twisted Blackstone's grief into an obsession with controlling and profiting from the creatures he blamed for his loss. The convergence of these 3 lives would begin in 12 hours, when Joe's routine patrol of Specimen Ridge Trail would lead him to a clearing he hadn't visited since the day he'd rescued an orphaned bear cub from poachers 15 years earlier. That cub, now an 800-pound matriarch with a distinctive facial scar and the remnants of a broken collar around her massive neck, had been waiting patiently for his return. The September morning carried the crisp promise of autumn as Joe loaded his patrol pack with the usual supplies, first aid kit, radio, emergency flares, and a thermos of coffee that would probably grow cold before he had a chance to drink it. The Specimen Ridge Trail stretched 12 miles through some of Yellowstone's most remote backcountry, a route Joe had walked thousands of times but never grew tired of exploring. "Heading out to check the northern markers, Mary," he radioed to the dispatch center as his boots hit the trailhead. "Should be back by 4. "Copy that, Joe. Weather Service is calling for clear skies, so you picked a good day for it," came Mary's familiar voice through the static. "Stay safe out there." The first 6 miles passed without incident, Joe's practiced eye noting the subtle signs of wildlife activity: fresh elk scat, claw marks on aspen bark where bears had been feeding, the delicate tracks of a mountain lion that had passed during the night. His grandfather had taught him to read the forest like a book, and today the story seemed peaceful enough. It was just past noon when Joe reached the steep switchbacks that led to Specimen Ridge proper. The elevation gain here was significant, and he'd been feeling more winded during these climbs lately. His doctor in Cody had mentioned something about irregular heartbeats during his last physical, but Joe had dismissed it as the normal wear and tear of a life spent outdoors. The pain started as a dull ache in his chest, nothing more than what he'd attributed to morning stiffness or sleeping wrong on his old mattress. But as he climbed higher, the ache transformed into a vice-like pressure that made each breath feel like work. Joe paused against a lodgepole pine, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool mountain air. "Just need a minute," he told himself, the words coming out more breathless than he'd intended. The pain radiated down his left arm now, and somewhere in the back of his mind, the medical training from his early ranger days began sounding alarm bells. He fumbled for his radio with trembling fingers. "Mary, this is Joe. I'm having some chest pain up on the ridge. Might need—" The world tilted sideways as the massive coronary hit him like a sledgehammer. Joe's weathered hand gripped the radio as his heart hammered against his ribs, then suddenly stopped mid-transmission. The device slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the pine needle carpet as his knees buckled. The last thing Joe remembered with any clarity was the way the afternoon sunlight filtered through the canopy above him, creating patterns of gold and green that reminded him of the kaleidoscope Emily had loved as a child. Then consciousness fled, leaving him sprawled in a clearing that held memories he couldn't access in his current state. What Joe couldn't know, was that this particular clearing held significance beyond his failing memory. 15 years earlier, on a bitter February morning, he'd heard the distressed cries of a bear cub echoing through these same trees. Poachers had killed the mother and were preparing to transport the orphaned cub to a black market buyer when Joe had intervened, calling for backup and ensuring the cub was relocated to a safe area deeper in the park. The cub had been small then, maybe 60 pounds, with a distinctive marking across her left eye where a poacher's snare had scarred her. Joe had stayed with her during the veterinary examination, speaking in the soft, rhythmic tones his grandfather had taught him, until her frightened whimpering had finally stopped. Now, 8 hours after Joe's collapse, that same cub, grown into an 800-pound matriarch that locals had dubbed Old Mother, emerged from the tree line with her family group. 5 younger bears followed her lead as she approached the motionless figure in the clearing, her massive head tilting as she caught the scent of the man who had once saved her life. The recognition was immediate and profound. This was the 2-legged creature who had spoken the old language, whose hands had been gentle when she was small and afraid, whose voice had carried the promise that she would be safe. Without hesitation, Old Mother positioned herself beside Joe's unconscious form, her enormous body creating a windbreak as the mountain evening grew cold. One by one, the other bears followed her lead, forming a protective circle around the fallen ranger. The youngest, a 2-year-old male with curiosity that often got him into trouble, crept closer to sniff at Joe's still form before settling down near his feet. Another bear, a pregnant female heavy with cubs she would deliver in the coming months, took position at Joe's head, her breath creating small clouds of warmth in the cooling air. Through the long night they maintained their vigil, shifting positions only to ensure Joe remained protected from the elements and any potential threats that might emerge from the darkness of the Wyoming wilderness. The search began at dawn when Joe failed to check in for his evening radio call. Mary Thunderheart had worked with enough missing persons cases to know that in the wilderness, every hour mattered exponentially. She assembled a team of 6 rangers and volunteers, including Tom Blackfoot, a rookie who'd grown up hunting these mountains with his grandfather. "Joe's truck is still at the Specimen Ridge trailhead," reported Ranger Susan Crow Feather over the radio as Mary's team hiked into the backcountry. "Footprints head north toward the high country, but they're 8 hours old now." Mary pushed the team hard, knowing Joe's medical history better than most. He'd never admitted to heart problems, but she'd noticed him taking longer breaks during joint patrols, seen him pause to catch his breath when he thought no one was looking. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. "When an elder goes to the mountain alone, the mountain decides if he comes back." It was Tom who spotted them first through his binoculars, just as the morning sun crested the ridge and illuminated the clearing below. "Mary," he whispered, his voice tight with disbelief. "You need to see this." Mary focused her own binoculars and felt her breath catch in her throat. 6 massive grizzly bears had formed a perfect protective circle around what appeared to be a human figure lying motionless in the center. The largest bear, a female with distinctive scarring across her left eye, lay directly beside the person, her massive frame creating a living shelter. "Sweet Jesus," whispered Tom. "They're not attacking him. They're guarding him." Mary's training warred with what her eyes were telling her. Grizzly bears were solitary creatures outside of mating season and family groups. They certainly didn't form protective formations around humans. That behavior simply didn't exist in any wildlife manual she'd ever studied. Yet there it was, undeniable and impossible. "That's Joe," she confirmed, recognizing his red flannel shirt and gray hair even from a distance. "He's been down there all night." The scene defied every protocol for bear encounters. The team should retreat, call for specialized wildlife management, wait for tranquilizer equipment. But Joe had been unconscious for nearly 12 hours now, and Mary could see his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths that suggested he was still alive, but in critical condition. "We go in slow," Mary decided, knowing she was making a choice that could end in disaster. "No sudden movements. Tom, you stay here with the radio. If this goes bad, you call for immediate evacuation." As Mary and 2 other rangers began their careful descent into the clearing, the bear's behavior became even more puzzling. The scarred female, clearly the matriarch of the group, raised her massive head and fixed her dark eyes on the approaching humans. But instead of the aggressive posturing they expected, she seemed to be assessing them, deciding whether they posed a threat to the unconscious man she was protecting. The largest male, easily 900 pounds, shifted position to allow the rangers better access to Joe while maintaining his protective stance. A younger female with 2 cubs actually moved her offspring further away, as if recognizing that human help was needed and removing potential complications from the situation. "This is impossible," breathed Ranger Mike Standing Bear, a 20-year veteran who'd seen his share of unusual wildlife behavior. "It's like they're cooperating with us." Mary knelt beside Joe, checking his pulse while keeping one eye on the scarred matriarch who watched her every movement with intelligent intensity. His heartbeat was irregular and weak, his skin clammy and pale. Classic signs of cardiac distress, but he was alive, something that should have been impossible after a night exposed to mountain cold and surrounded by predators. The big female kept him warm all night, Mary realized, noting that Joe's core temperature seemed stable despite the freezing overnight conditions. Look at how she's positioned. She's been using her body heat to prevent hypothermia. As if responding to Mary's observation, the scarred bear slowly rose to her feet and took several steps back, though her eyes never left Joe's face. The movement revealed something that made Mary's breath catch: a broken metal collar around the bear's massive neck, partially grown over with fur and scar tissue. "That's a research collar," Mike observed, "but it's old, maybe 15 years. And it's been damaged, like someone cut it off." Mary's grandfather had often spoken of the old ways, when the boundary between human and animal was understood differently. He told stories of the time before, when people knew the language that all creatures shared and recognized the debts that could exist between species. Looking at the scarred bear's intelligent gaze, Mary felt the whisper of those ancient truths. "We need to get him out of here," she said, keying her radio. "Tom, call for immediate medical evacuation. Tell them we need a cardiac team standing by." As the Rangers carefully lifted Joe onto a portable stretcher, the circle of bears maintained their positions, watching but not interfering. The scarred matriarch followed their progress to the edge of the clearing, her massive form moving with surprising grace through the undergrowth. When the helicopter finally arrived an hour later, rotors thundering over the forest canopy, Mary looked back one final time. The bears had vanished back into the wilderness as silently as they'd appeared, leaving behind only pressed vegetation and the impossible memory of what she'd witnessed. During the flight to the hospital in Cody, Joe stirred briefly, his eyes fluttering open to focus on Mary's face. "The bears," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the helicopter's noise. "Did you see old Mother?" Mary squeezed his weathered hand. "Rest now, Joe. We'll talk when you're stronger." But as the helicopter carried them away from Specimen Ridge, Mary couldn't shake the feeling that they'd witnessed something extraordinary, a connection that transcended the normal boundaries between human and wild, a debt of gratitude that had been waiting 15 years to be repaid. The beeping of cardiac monitors filled the sterile hospital room where Joe drifted in and out of consciousness for 3 days. Dr. Patricia Yellowbird, the cardiologist who'd treated him since his arrival, delivered news that Joe had been expecting but hoping to avoid. "You've suffered a significant myocardial infarction, Joe. Your heart sustained considerable damage, and I'm afraid there are underlying issues we need to discuss." Mary sat beside his bed when he finally awakened fully, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. "You scared us, old man," she said, though her relief was evident. "The whole park's been talking about what happened up there." "The bears," Joe said immediately, his voice raspy from the breathing tube they'd removed that morning. "Mary, you saw them. Tell me you saw them." "I saw them, Joe. We all did." Mary leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "That big female with the scar? She stayed with you all night. Kept you warm, protected you from the cold. Doc says if you'd been exposed to the elements without shelter, you wouldn't have made it." Joe closed his eyes, and for a moment Mary thought he'd fallen back asleep. But when he opened them again, tears were streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I know her," he whispered. "I know exactly who she is." The story came out slowly, in fragments between medical checks and visits from concerned colleagues. 15 years earlier, Joe had been patrolling the same area during a bitter February when he'd heard the distressed cries of a bear cub. Poachers had killed the mother and were preparing to transport the orphaned cub when Joe intervened, calling for backup and ensuring the cub was relocated to safety. "She was so small," Joe told Mary, his voice thick with memory. "Maybe 60 pounds, with that scar across her eye where their snare had caught her. I stayed with her during the vet exam, talked to her the way my grandfather taught me. She was terrified, but she listened. She knew I was trying to help. Mary felt goosebumps rise on her arms as she remembered the intelligent way the scarred bear had watched them work to save Joe. "You think she remembered you after all these years?" "Animals don't forget kindness," Joe said simply. "My grandfather always told me that every good deed creates a debt in the natural world, and someday, somehow, that debt gets paid." The story might have remained a private miracle between friends, but Tom Blackfoot had been recording with his phone when they discovered Joe in the clearing. The footage, grainy but unmistakable, showed the circle of bears and their protective behavior. Within hours of Tom sharing it with his girlfriend, the video had spread across social media with hashtags like #BearsGuardRanger and #WildernessAngels. News crews arrived at the hospital by the second day, followed by wildlife researchers, documentary filmmakers, and curiosity seekers. Joe refused most interviews, but the story took on a life of its own. Cable news networks picked it up, celebrities shared it, and suddenly Joe Whitehorse became the face of an impossible bond between human and animal. It was on the fourth day that Dr. William Blackstone arrived, introducing himself as a wildlife behaviorist from the University of Montana. Tall and distinguished with silver hair and expensive clothes, he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Mr. Whitehorse," Blackstone said, settling into the chair beside Joe's bed with practiced ease, "I've been following your remarkable story. What you've experienced could revolutionize our understanding of interspecies communication and memory." Joe studied the man carefully, noting the manicured hands that had never held an axe or skinned a deer, the shoes that had never walked a trail longer than a university campus path. "And what exactly are you hoping to understand, Dr. Blackstone?" "I'd like to study these bears, of course, document their behavior, run some tests to understand what makes them so unique. The scientific applications could be extraordinary." Something cold settled in Joe's chest that had nothing to do with his heart condition. Tests? Nothing invasive, naturally. Just tracking collars, behavioral observation, maybe some blood samples to check for unusual neurochemical patterns. The bears that protected you could be the key to understanding animal consciousness in ways we've never imagined. Mary, who had been quietly listening from the corner, spoke up. "And what happens to the bears during these studies?" Blackstone's smile never wavered. "They'd be relocated to a controlled environment where we can observe them properly. There are excellent facilities that specialize in this kind of research. The knowledge we could gain would benefit wildlife conservation for generations." "You want to put them in cages," Joe said flatly. "Research facilities," Blackstone corrected smoothly. "Very comfortable, very humane. And of course you'd be compensated for your cooperation. The university has grants available, and there are private foundations interested in funding this kind of groundbreaking work." Joe turned his head toward the window, looking out at the mountains that had been his home for 63 years. "How much?" $2 million, Blackstone said without hesitation, "for exclusive access to the bears and your cooperation with the research program." The number hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. $2 million would solve every financial worry Joe had ever faced, would ensure he could afford the medical treatments Dr. Yellowbird said he needed, would leave something behind when he was gone. But it would also mean betraying the trust of the creature who had saved his life. "I need time to think," Joe said finally. "Of course. But I should mention that time is somewhat of a factor. Other researchers have already requested permits to study these bears. If we don't act quickly, someone else will, and they might not be as considerate of your relationship with them." After Blackstone left, Joe lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the hospital around him, the hum of machinery, the soft footsteps of nurses, the distant ping of elevator doors. Through his window he could see the outline of the mountains where Old Mother was probably teaching her cubs to fish in the streams, to recognize the signs of changing weather, to survive in a world that grew more dangerous for their kind every year. Mary returned the next morning to find Joe fully dressed and arguing with a nurse about discharge papers. "I'm going home," he announced when he saw her. "Doc says I need to take it easy, but she cleared me for light activity." "Joe, you nearly died 4 days ago." "And now I'm not dead," he replied with a stubborn set to his jaw that Mary recognized from years of working with him. "I need to go back up there, Mary. I need to see if she's still around." The drive back to Joe's cabin took 20 minutes, during which Mary tried to talk him out of whatever he was planning. But she'd known Joe Whitehorse long enough to recognize when his mind was made up. He'd inherited his grandfather's streak of quiet determination, the kind that could move mountains if necessary. At the cabin, Joe packed a simple day pack with water, some jerky, and a small bundle wrapped in soft deerskin that he tucked carefully into the bottom. Mary watched him move slowly but purposefully, favoring his left arm where the IV had been. "What's in the bundle?" she asked. Joe paused, his weathered hands gentle on the deerskin. "Emily's teddy bear, the one she carried everywhere until she was 10. I've been meaning to find the right place for it." They drove to the Specimen Ridge trailhead in Joe's pickup, Mary insisting on coming along despite Joe's protests. The hike to the clearing where he'd collapsed took nearly 3 hours, Joe stopping frequently to rest and catch his breath. But his steps grew more certain as they climbed higher, as if the mountain itself was calling him home. The clearing looked different in daylight, smaller somehow, just an ordinary patch of meadow surrounded by lodgepole pines and aspen trees beginning to turn gold with autumn. But Joe walked directly to the center, to the spot where the grass was still pressed flat from where he'd fallen. "She's here," he said quietly, though Mary couldn't see or hear anything unusual. It was another 10 minutes before Old Mother emerged from the tree line, moving with the deliberate caution of a creature that had learned to be wary of humans. But when she saw Joe, something changed in her massive form. Her ears came forward, her head tilted, and she made a soft chuffing sound that seemed almost like a greeting. Joe knelt slowly, pulling the deerskin bundle from his pack. Inside was a small brown teddy bear worn soft from years of love, with one button eye missing and stuffing showing through a carefully mended seam. "This belonged to my daughter," Joe said, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "She died 8 years ago, and I've been lost ever since." Old Mother approached cautiously, her massive head lowering to sniff the offered bear. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the boundaries between species dissolved. Joe reached out with trembling fingers to touch the scar across her left eye, the mark that had been there since she was a frightened cub. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for giving me a reason to keep living." The bear's response was gentle, almost maternal. She nuzzled the teddy bear, then carefully picked it up in her massive jaws and carried it to the base of a large pine tree. There she began to arrange pine boughs and soft grass around it, creating a small nest that somehow felt both wild and sacred. Mary watched from the edge of the clearing, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed something that belonged to the old stories, to the time when the world was younger and the connections between all living things were understood differently. This wasn't science or research or anything that could be measured in a laboratory. This was love, pure and simple, crossing the boundaries that humans had created to separate themselves from the rest of creation. When Joe finally stood to leave, Old Mother followed them partway down the trail, stopping only when they reached the boundary of her territory. Joe turned back once to see her silhouette against the evening sky, a guardian watching over the mountains that were both prison and paradise. "What are you going to tell Dr. Blackstone?" Mary asked as they walked back toward the truck. Joe was quiet for a long moment, listening to the evening sounds of the forest around them, the call of a loon from a distant lake, the rustle of wind through aspen leaves, the distant howl of wolves claiming their territory for the night. "I'm going to tell him that some things are worth more than money," Joe said finally, "and some relationships are too sacred to be studied." Dr. William Blackstone's patience had worn thin by the time Joe returned his call 3 days later. The preliminary permits for wildlife capture had already been filed, and the research team was assembling equipment in Missoula. Private funding from pharmaceutical interests had reached 8 figures, all contingent on exclusive access to the bears that had demonstrated such unprecedented protective behavior. "Mr. Whitehorse," Blackstone's voice carried an edge of controlled irritation over the phone, "I trust you've had time to consider our offer. The scientific community is quite eager to begin this groundbreaking research." Joe sat on his cabin porch, watching the evening shadows lengthen across the meadow where elk often grazed. Emily's empty rocking chair moved gently in the autumn breeze beside him, a reminder of conversations that would never happen again. "I've given it considerable thought, Dr. Blackstone, and my answer is no." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Joe wondered if the connection had been lost. When Blackstone finally spoke, his voice had transformed from academic politeness to something much colder. "That's disappointing, Mr. Whitehorse, especially considering your financial situation. My financial situation is none of your concern, isn't it? A man your age, living on a ranger's pension, facing extensive cardiac treatment costs. I did some research on your background. Your daughter's medical expenses from her combat injuries before she died, the mortgage you took out to pay for her care. You're drowning in debt, Joe. This offer could solve all of that." Joe's grip tightened on the phone. Emily's medical bills had indeed been crushing. Experimental treatments not covered by military insurance, private facilities when the VA couldn't provide adequate care, the desperate hope of a father trying to save his only child. He'd mortgaged everything he owned and still hadn't been enough. $2.5 million, Blackstone continued, sensing weakness. "Final offer. All you have to do is provide location information and stay out of our way during the capture process. The bears will be well cared for and you'll have financial security for the rest of your life." "Those bears saved my life. And now they can save your financial future. This is a business transaction, Mr. Whitehorse. Don't let sentiment cloud your judgment." Joe ended the call without responding, but Blackstone's words lingered like smoke in his mind. That night, he sat at his kitchen table surrounded by medical bills and bank statements, adding numbers that never seemed to get smaller no matter how he arranged them. Dr. Yellowbird had been clear about his prognosis. Without proper cardiac care, he had perhaps 6 months. With treatment, maybe 2 years. Either way, time was running short. The sound of vehicles arriving before dawn woke Joe from fitful sleep. Through his bedroom window, he watched 3 black SUVs park along the road near his property. Men in tactical gear emerged, carrying equipment that looked more military than scientific. A familiar figure stepped out of the lead vehicle, Dr. Blackstone, but now dressed in camouflage and speaking into a radio with the authority of someone accustomed to command. Joe dressed quickly and stepped onto his porch as Blackstone approached with 2 armed men flanking him. In daylight, the academic facade had dropped completely. This was someone used to taking what he wanted, regardless of permission. "Good morning, Joe," Blackstone said with a smile that never reached his eyes. "I hope you don't mind, but we've decided to proceed with the research project. Your cooperation would still be appreciated, but it's no longer required. You can't just capture protected wildlife without proper permits." "Actually, I can." Blackstone produced a folder thick with official documents. "Emergency Wildlife Management Authorization signed by the state director yesterday. It seems there's been concern about aggressive bear behavior in the park. Bears that have lost their natural fear of humans pose a significant public safety threat. Joe scanned the paperwork, recognizing the bureaucratic language that could justify almost anything. Someone with significant influence had fast-tracked these permits, bypassing the normal review process that should have taken months. "The incident with you has been reclassified," Blackstone continued. "Instead of protective behavior, it's now considered evidence of dangerous habituation. These bears have become too comfortable around humans and need to be relocated for public safety." "That's a lie, and you know it." "Truth is relative, Joe. What matters is what the paperwork says. My team will begin tracking operations this morning. We should have the animals in custody within 48 hours. As if summoned by their conversation, Mary Thunderheart's patrol vehicle appeared around the bend, kicking up dust as she accelerated toward them. She parked quickly and approached the group with the controlled tension of someone preparing for a fight. "Dr. Blackstone," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I wasn't aware you had authorization for capture operations in my jurisdiction. Ms. Thunderheart, your cooperation isn't required, but it would make things simpler. We have full authority to proceed." Mary examined the permits with the thoroughness of someone who'd spent years navigating government bureaucracy. "These are state permits for federal land." "That's not how jurisdiction works." "I think you'll find that recent emergency protocols have clarified those boundaries," Blackstone replied smoothly. "But if you'd like to challenge the paperwork, you're welcome to file an appeal. The process usually takes 6 to 8 months. The threat was clear. By the time any legal challenge worked through the system, the bears would be long gone. Joe watched Mary's jaw tighten as she realized the same thing. "There's something else you should know," Blackstone said, turning back to Joe. "My research isn't purely academic. The pharmaceutical applications for compounds found in bear adrenal glands are quite valuable. The stress hormones these particular bears produce could lead to breakthrough treatments for cardiac patients like yourself." The irony wasn't lost on Joe. The creatures that had saved his life could be killed to create medicine for his condition. "How do you extract these compounds?" "The process requires fresh tissue samples." "So, unfortunately, that means the subjects need to be harvested while the stress hormones are at peak levels." Mary stepped forward, her hand instinctively moving toward the radio on her belt. "You're talking about killing them. I'm talking about advancing medical science. These bears will contribute more to human welfare dead than they ever could alive. It's a simple cost-benefit analysis." The mask had completely dropped now. This wasn't a researcher interested in animal behavior. This was a man who saw living creatures as nothing more than raw materials for profit. Joe thought of old Mother's gentle touch when she'd arranged Emily's teddy bear, the intelligence in her dark eyes, the way she'd risked her own safety to protect him. "Over my dead body," Joe said quietly. Blackstone's smile turned predatory. "That can be arranged too, old man. These mountains are dangerous places. Accidents happen, especially to people with heart conditions who overexert themselves in high-altitude environments." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Mary's hand moved openly to her sidearm now, though she was outnumbered 3 to 1 by Blackstone's team. "You have 12 hours to reconsider," Blackstone said, stepping back toward his vehicle. "After that, we begin capture operations with or without your cooperation. And Joe, accidents in the wilderness are remarkably difficult to investigate thoroughly." After the convoy departed, Joe and Mary stood in the settling dust, both understanding that the situation had escalated beyond anything they could handle through official channels. The corruption ran too deep, the financial interests too powerful. "We have to warn them," Mary said. "Get to the bears before Blackstone's team does." Joe nodded, already calculating the fastest route to the high country where Old Mother's family group usually spent their days. But as he gathered his gear, a darker plan began forming in his mind. Blackstone had made one crucial mistake. He'd revealed the timeline. 12 hours. In 12 hours, it would be dark. And Joe Whitehorse knew these mountains better than any outsider ever would, even with their technology and weapons. He'd been walking these trails since before some of Blackstone's team were born, knew every game path and hidden canyon, every shelter where a desperate man might make his final stand. "Mary," he said, as they prepared to head into the backcountry, "I need you to know something. This morning, before you arrived, I got some test results from Dr. Yellowbird." Mary's face went pale. "Joe, 6 months, maybe less. The damage to my heart is too extensive for surgery, and I can't afford the treatments that might buy me more time." He shouldered his pack, heavier now with supplies for what might be his last journey into the wilderness. "Sometimes a man gets to choose how his story ends. I'd rather die protecting something I love than waste away in a hospital bed. There has to be another way." Joe looked toward the mountains where Old Mother was probably teaching her cubs to recognize the scent of approaching winter, to find shelter when the storms came, to survive in a world that grew more hostile each year. "Maybe," he said, "but if there isn't, I want you to know that these past few days, since she saved my life, have been the most peace I've felt since Emily died. That bear gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" "A family to protect." The pursuit began at dawn, just as Blackstone had promised. Joe and Mary had spent the night in the high country, tracking Old Mother's family group to a secluded valley near Yellowstone Lake where the bears were feeding on the last salmon run of the season. The sight of the massive creatures teaching their cubs to fish in the crystal-clear water felt like glimpsing Eden before the fall. "They're coming," Mary whispered, pointing to the distant glint of sunlight off metal equipment moving through the tree line. 3 teams, maybe 4. They've got tranquilizer guns and transport cages." Joe's chest tightened with more than just cardiac stress as he watched Blackstone's operation unfold with military precision. The teams moved in coordinated sweeps, using radio communication and GPS tracking to systematically close off escape routes. These weren't researchers, they were hunters, and Old Mother's family were their prey. "We can't outrun them," Joe said, calculating distances and terrain in his mind, "but we don't have to. We just need to get the bears to higher ground, to the places where their vehicles can't follow." What followed was a desperate game of cat and mouse through some of the most rugged terrain in North America. Joe led Old Mother and her family up treacherous game trails that he'd learned as a boy, paths that existed more in memory than on any map. His grandfather had shown him these routes during hunting trips decades ago, secret ways through the mountains that could hide an entire war party if necessary. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was using the hunting knowledge passed down through generations of his people to protect the very animals his ancestors had once stalked for survival. But times had changed, and the greater threat now came from men in expensive gear who killed not for food or ceremony, but for profit. Mary stayed with the rescue teams that were supposedly coordinating the search, feeding Blackstone false information about Joe's location while secretly using her radio to warn him of incoming pursuit teams. "They're moving up the eastern ridge," she whispered into her radio during what appeared to be a routine check-in. "Joe's heading toward Specimen Creek." In reality, Joe was moving in the opposite direction, leading the bears through a maze of hidden canyons toward the remote thermal features that most tourists never saw. Old Mother seemed to understand the urgency, keeping her cubs close while maintaining the steady pace that only wild animals could sustain over long distances. The first tranquilizer dart missed Joe's head by inches, embedding in a pine tree with a soft thud that sent bark flying. He dove behind a boulder as shouts erupted from the pursuit team behind them, automatic weapons replacing the scientific equipment in a show of force that revealed Blackstone's true intentions. "There!" someone shouted. "The old man's with them!" More shots followed, not tranquilizers now, but live ammunition that splintered trees and sent rock fragments flying. Joe's heart hammered against his ribs as he scrambled higher up the slope, Old Mother and her family disappearing into thick underbrush ahead of him. The pursuit had become a hunt, and Joe was no longer just a guide. He was prey. Hours passed in a blur of desperate movement through terrain that grew increasingly treacherous. Joe's cardiac medication had worn off, leaving him gasping for breath at an altitude that would challenge a healthy man half his age. But adrenaline and desperation drove him forward, along with the knowledge that stopping meant death for both him and the creatures he was trying to protect. It was near midday when disaster struck. Following a game trail along a narrow ledge above a deep ravine, Joe's weakened legs finally betrayed him. His foot slipped on loose scree, and suddenly he was falling, tumbling down a rocky slope that seemed to go on forever. The impact at the bottom drove the air from his lungs and sent lightning bolts of pain through his left shoulder. Worse, his chest felt like someone had driven a spike through his heart. Another massive coronary, worse than the first one, was crushing his life away with each struggling heartbeat. Joe lay gasping at the bottom of the ravine, unable to move, watching his vision blur as his damaged heart fought to keep pumping. Above him, he could hear the shouts of Blackstone's team as they discovered his trail and began their descent. He'd bought Old Mother maybe an hour of lead time, but it wouldn't be enough. Through the haze of pain and approaching unconsciousness, Joe heard something that made him think he was hallucinating. The soft, chuffing sound of bear communication, growing closer. Massive paws crunched through the underbrush, and suddenly, Old Mother's scarred face appeared above him. She had come back. The enormous bear sniffed him carefully, her intelligent eyes taking in his condition with the assessment of a creature who understood death when she saw it approaching. Behind her, the younger bears emerged from the trees. All of them. The entire family group that should have been running for their lives. Instead, they had chosen to stay with him. "No," Joe whispered, using what little breath he had left. "Run. Save your babies. Run." But Old Mother had made her decision. With surprising gentleness for such a massive creature, she positioned herself over Joe's broken body, creating a living shelter as she had that first night. The other bears formed their protective circle again, facing outward toward the sounds of approaching hunters. The first of Blackstone's team rappelled down the cliff face 20 minutes later, automatic weapons ready. What they found waiting for them was 6 grizzly bears in full defensive posture, protecting a dying man who had risked everything to save them. "Jesus Christ," breathed the team leader, a mercenary named Robert Steelheart, who'd hunted everything from African elephants to Siberian tigers. "They're not running." Above them, Blackstone's voice crackled over the radio with cold satisfaction. "Perfect. We'll take them all at once. Use the high-powered tranquilizers. I want them unconscious but alive for transport." The battle that followed was unlike anything in the recorded history of human-wildlife conflict. Old Mother and her family fought not as individual animals defending territory, but as a coordinated unit protecting a fallen member of their pack. They had chosen Joe as family, and they would die defending him if necessary. Tranquilizer darts flew through the air as the bears charged and retreated, using the rocky terrain to their advantage. 2 of the younger bears went down quickly, but Old Mother seemed to absorb the drugs without effect, her massive frame and adrenaline-fueled determination keeping her conscious long after she should have collapsed. Joe watched the carnage through eyes that could barely focus, his failing heart breaking as he witnessed the price of his protection. These magnificent creatures were being destroyed because of him, because he'd been too weak and too poor to find another way. The end came when Old Mother finally succumbed to the 4th tranquilizer dart, her massive body crashing to the earth beside Joe's broken form. Her dark eyes found his as consciousness faded, and in that final moment of connection, Joe saw something that would haunt his last breaths: forgiveness. Even as she died protecting him, even as her family lay unconscious around her, Old Mother looked at him with the same gentle recognition she'd shown when he was a young ranger saving a frightened cub. She understood that he had tried, that he had risked everything, and she bore him no anger for the failure. "Load them up," Blackstone's voice echoed off the canyon walls as his team moved in with the transport cages. "The old man, too. I want him alive for questioning." But as rough hands lifted Joe onto a stretcher, his heart finally gave out completely. The last thing he saw was Old Mother's still form being winched up the cliff face in a metal cage, a prisoner destined for a laboratory where her final moments would be spent in service to the profit margins of men who saw her only as raw material. Joe Whitehorse died as he had lived, trying to protect something he loved. But in his final moments, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed in the most fundamental way possible. The family that had saved his life was now paying the ultimate price for his inability to save theirs. The ravens that gathered in the canyon that evening seemed to mourn not just the death of a man, but the breaking of an ancient covenant between species that had endured for thousands of years until greed finally severed it forever. Mary Thunderheart stood over Joe's body in the canyon, her hands shaking with rage as Blackstone's team loaded the unconscious bears into transport cages. The sight of Old Mother's massive form crammed into a metal container barely large enough to hold her was almost unbearable. But what broke Mary's heart completely was the way the great bear's paw hung limply through the bars, still reaching toward where Joe had fallen. "This is murder," she told Blackstone, as his men prepared to winch the cages up the cliff face. "Joe died trying to protect them, and you killed him for it." Blackstone barely looked up from his clipboard, making notes about dosage levels and transport logistics. "Mr. Whitehorse died of natural causes. Cardiac arrest brought on by strenuous activity at high altitude, very tragic but hardly unexpected given his medical condition. You chased him to his death. I conducted a legal wildlife management operation. If he chose to interfere, that was his decision." Blackstone finally met her eyes, and Mary saw something there that chilled her blood. "You'd be wise to remember that, Ms. Thunderheart. Accidents happen to people who ask too many questions." But Mary had been raised by a grandfather who'd fought in 3 wars and a father who'd never backed down from a just cause. Lakota blood ran in her veins, carrying the memory of ancestors who'd died rather than surrender their principles. She keyed her radio with deliberate precision. "All units, this is Thunderheart. We have multiple fatalities in Sector 7. Requesting immediate FBI response for investigation of potential federal crimes." Blackstone's hand moved toward his sidearm, but Mary's was already drawn, trained on his chest with the steady grip of someone who'd spent her life in law enforcement. "I wouldn't," she said quietly. "My grandfather always told me that some battles are worth dying for." The standoff lasted only seconds before Blackstone's radio crackled with an urgent transmission. "Sir, we've got a problem. Multiple vehicles approaching from the south, looks like federal agents and news crews." Mary smiled grimly. "I may not have been able to save Joe, but I made some calls before we came up here. Seems like several wildlife advocacy groups received anonymous tips about illegal capture operations. They brought friends from the media." Below them in the canyon, the sound of helicopters began to echo off the rock walls. Not just 1 or 2, but a fleet of aircraft carrying news crews, federal investigators, and wildlife officials who'd been tracking reports of unauthorized research operations for months. Within hours, the scene had transformed from Blackstone's private operation into a federal crime scene. Agent Sarah Crowdog of the FBI's Environmental Crime Unit took charge of the investigation. Her Sioux heritage and personal commitment to protecting tribal lands making her particularly motivated to pursue justice. Dr. Blackstone, Agent Crow Dog said as she placed him in handcuffs beside the transport vehicles. "You're under arrest for violation of the Endangered Species Act, conspiracy to commit wildlife trafficking, and about a dozen other federal charges. We've been building a case against your pharmaceutical operation for 2 years." The revelation hit Mary like a thunderbolt. "You've been investigating him?" "William Blackstone isn't really a doctor," Crow Dog explained as her team secured the scene. "He's William Brennan, former military contractor who's been running illegal animal trafficking operations across 3 states. The university credentials were fake, the research permits were forged, and the pharmaceutical company is a front for selling endangered species parts to overseas buyers." As the truth unfolded, Mary learned that Joe's death had been the final piece of evidence needed to bring down an operation that had been responsible for the deaths of hundreds of protected animals. Blackstone's team had been tracking social media for viral animal stories, then using fabricated emergency permits to capture and sell the animals involved. Old Mother and her family would have disappeared into the black market, Crow Dog continued. Bear gallbladders and adrenal glands sell for thousands of dollars in certain overseas markets. Mr. Whitehorse died protecting them, but his sacrifice may have saved dozens of other animals. The bears were still unconscious when the veterinary team arrived, but Dr. Maria Santos, a wildlife specialist from the University of Wyoming, pronounced them all stable. "The tranquilizer dosages were dangerously high," she reported. "Another hour and we might have lost them to overdose." Mary stayed with the bears as they were transported to a proper wildlife rehabilitation facility, her hand resting on Old Mother's cage as the great bear slowly regained consciousness. When those intelligent dark eyes finally opened and focused on Mary's face, she whispered the words Joe had asked her to deliver. "He loved you," she said softly. "You were his family, and he died protecting you because that's what family does." Old Mother's response was a low rumble that seemed to carry the weight of grief itself. The bear's massive paw reached through the bars again, not grasping, but offering, as if she understood that Mary was mourning too. 3 days later, as Joe's body was prepared for burial according to Cherokee tradition, Dr. Santos made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden in Old Mother's fur was a small metal object that had been overlooked during the initial examination, a locket that had fallen from Joe's neck during the final confrontation. Inside the locket was a photograph of Emily in her Army uniform, along with a tiny braid of sweetgrass that Joe's grandfather had given him as a boy. But there was something else, a small piece of paper with writing in Joe's careful hand. "For Old Mother, who taught me that family isn't about blood, it's about choice." Mary broke down completely when she read those words, understanding finally what Joe had been trying to tell her during those last days. He hadn't just been protecting the bears from Blackstone's greed. He'd been protecting his family, the only real family he'd had since Emily died. The funeral drew people from across the region, park rangers, tribal elders, wildlife advocates, and ordinary citizens who'd been moved by the story of a man who'd died protecting the animals that had saved his life. Mary spoke for Joe, sharing his belief that the connections between all living things were sacred, that love could transcend the boundaries humans created to separate themselves from the natural world. But the most powerful moment came when Old Mother and her family were released back into the wild. The bears had been fitted with GPS collars for monitoring, but otherwise they were free to return to their mountain home. Dr. Santos had recommended releasing them far from the original capture site, but Mary insisted they be returned to the clearing where Joe had first collapsed. "This is where their story with him began," she explained. "It should be where it ends, too." The release was filmed by documentary crews who'd been following the case, but what happened next surprised everyone. Instead of immediately disappearing into the forest as expected, Old Mother led her family to the exact spot where Joe had fallen. There, She began to dig in the soft earth with her massive claws, creating a shallow depression in the ground. One by one, the other bears brought offerings, stones, pine cones, branches arranged in a careful pattern around the depression. It was behavior that wildlife experts had never documented before, a ritual that seemed to honor the memory of the man who'd died protecting them. Mary watched through tears as Old Mother placed the final offering in the center of the arrangement, Emily's teddy bear, which had somehow survived the chaos of the capture and been returned with Joe's other possessions. The bear had carried it in her mouth for 3 days, never letting it out of her sight. "They're mourning him," Dr. Santos whispered in amazement. "They understand that he's gone, and they're saying goodbye." The ceremony lasted until sunset, when Old Mother finally rose and led her family into the forest. But she stopped at the tree line and looked back once, her dark eyes finding Mary's across the clearing. In that moment of connection, Mary felt Joe's presence as surely as if he were standing beside her. The message was clear. The bond between them would continue, passed down through generations of bears who would remember the man who'd chosen to be their family. Love, Joe had always said, doesn't end with death. It transforms into something that can never be broken. As the bears disappeared into the wilderness, Mary whispered the traditional Lakota farewell, Mitakuye Oyasin, all my relations. It was what Joe would have wanted, she knew. In the end, he'd found his way home to the family that had been waiting for him all along. 6 months after Joe Whitehorse's funeral, Mary Thunderheart made her weekly pilgrimage to the clearing where everything had begun and ended. The memorial that Old Mother's family had created still remained, though nature had softened its edges with new growth and seasonal changes. Pine needles covered the carefully arranged stones, and wildflowers had sprouted around Emily's teddy bear, which somehow continued to rest at the center of the arrangement despite wind and weather. Mary wasn't alone on this particular visit. Dr. Maria Santos accompanied her, along with a small film crew documenting the ongoing story of the bears that had captured the world's attention. But the real surprise was the elderly Lakota man who emerged from the tree line as they approached the memorial, Thomas Whitehorse, Joe's grandfather, who at 93 had traveled from the Pine Ridge Reservation to see where his grandson had died. "I dreamed about this place," the old man said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "I saw Joe as a boy, learning the old ways. I saw him as a man, broken by loss. And I saw him at the end, finding peace with his 4-legged family." Thomas moved slowly but steadily to the center of the clearing, his weathered hands reaching into a beaded pouch to withdraw a bundle of sage and sweetgrass. As he lit the traditional smudge and began to pray in Lakota, the forest seemed to hold its breath in respectful silence. "Tunkasila, Grandmother Earth, we thank you for taking care of our brother Joe," he chanted, the smoke rising toward the canopy above. "We thank you for showing him that love has no boundaries, that family comes in many forms." It was during this ceremony that Old Mother appeared, stepping into the clearing with the same careful dignity she'd shown during Joe's final days. 6 months of freedom had been good to her. Her coat was thick and lustrous, her cubs had grown strong and confident, and her eyes held the peaceful alertness of a creature living exactly as nature intended. But what happened next amazed even Dr. Santos, who'd spent her career studying wildlife behavior. Old Mother approached Thomas directly, showing none of the wariness she displayed around other humans. The massive bear stopped just arm's length from the elderly man and sat back on her haunches, waiting. Thomas looked into her scarred face with the recognition of someone who understood the old languages that existed before words. Slowly, he reached out his gnarled hand and placed it gently on her massive head. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, man and bear shared something that had no name in any human vocabulary. "She knows," Thomas whispered, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "She knows who I am. She knows I'm Joe's family." Doctor. Santos had filmed thousands of hours of wildlife behavior, but nothing had prepared her for what she witnessed next. Old Mother rose and walked to the memorial site, carefully picking up Emily's teddy bear in her massive jaws. She carried it to Thomas and gently placed it at his feet, then returned to her position and watched him with expectant intelligence. "She's giving it back," Mary realized, her voice thick with emotion. "She's returning Emily's bear to Joe's family." Thomas picked up the small stuffed animal, holding it against his chest as sobs shook his frail frame. The teddy bear that had been Emily's comfort as a child, Joe's solace as a grieving father, and Old Mother's treasured memorial for 6 months, was returning home at last. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything captured on film before. Thomas spoke in Lakota while Old Mother listened, her massive head tilted as if she understood every word. He told her about Joe's childhood, about the young man who'd learned to speak with animals, about the father who'd lost everything and found family again in the most unexpected place. When he finished speaking, Old Mother rose and walked to the edge of the clearing. One by one, her cubs and the other bears emerged from the forest, 7 bears in total now, as 2 new cubs had been born during the winter. They formed a line facing Thomas, Mary, and the film crew, their massive forms backlit by the golden afternoon sun. "They're saying goodbye," Dr. Santos whispered, her camera capturing every moment. "This is a formal farewell." But Thomas shook his head, a smile creasing his ancient features. "No, granddaughter. This is a promise. They're telling us they'll remember. That the story continues." The bears began to disperse back into the forest, but Old Mother lingered. She approached Mary one final time, her dark eyes meeting the younger woman's with unmistakable intelligence. Then she did something that would become the most replayed moment in wildlife documentary history. She gently touched Mary's hand with her massive paw, holding the contact for several heartbeats before turning and disappearing into the trees. In the weeks that followed, the documentary footage sparked a global conversation about the emotional lives of animals and the connections that could exist between species. Scientists debated the evidence of mourning rituals and memory in bears, while spiritual leaders from indigenous communities spoke of ancient truths that modern people had forgotten. But the most powerful response came from an unexpected source. William Blackstone, awaiting trial in federal prison, granted a single interview to a wildlife journalist. Gone was the arrogant confidence he'd displayed during the capture operation. In its place was a broken man grappling with the weight of his crimes. "I watched the footage of the memorial ceremony," he said, his voice barely audible. "I saw what those bears did for that old man, and I realized what I'd tried to destroy. My son. My son would have been ashamed of what I became after he died." The interview revealed the full scope of Blackstone's operation. Hundreds of animals killed, dozens of species pushed closer to extinction, all in service of a pharmaceutical empire built on the commodification of suffering. But it also revealed something else: the possibility of redemption, even for those who'd lost their way in grief and greed. "Joe Whitehorse died protecting something beautiful," Blackstone continued. "I spent 20 years destroying it. The bears showed more humanity than I ever did." The trial that followed became a landmark case for wildlife protection laws. Blackstone received a life sentence without parole, and his conviction led to the dismantling of trafficking networks across 3 countries. More importantly, it established legal precedent for recognizing the emotional trauma that wildlife crimes inflicted on animal communities. Mary used her testimony at the trial to establish the Joseph Whitehorse Wildlife Sanctuary, a 50,000-acre preserve funded by donations from people around the world who'd been moved by the story. The sanctuary would protect not just individual animals, but entire ecosystems where the bonds between species could flourish without human interference. 1 year after Joe's death, Mary returned to the clearing for the anniversary of his passing. She brought with her a simple granite marker inscribed with words that Thomas had chosen. Joseph Whitehorse, beloved grandfather to all relations. As she placed the marker at the center of the memorial site, Mary heard the familiar sound of large paws moving through the underbrush. Old Mother emerged from the forest, now accompanied by 3 generations of bears, her original cubs, now nearly full-grown, and a new litter of twins born that spring. The great bear approached the marker slowly, sniffing the new addition to the memorial site. Then she did something that Mary would treasure for the rest of her life. She placed her massive paw on the granite stone and held it there, as if offering a blessing. "Thank you," Mary whispered. "Thank you for showing us what love really means." Old Mother's response was a low rumble that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself, a sound that spoke of continuity and connection, of bonds that death could not break. As the Bear family settled around the memorial for what appeared to be their own anniversary observance, Mary understood that Joe's story would never truly end. It would be passed down through generations of bears that would remember the man who'd chosen to be their family. It would live on in the hearts of people who'd learned that love recognizes no boundaries between species, and it would continue in the sanctuary that bore his name, where the ancient covenant between humans and animals could be honored and protected. As the sun set over the mountains that Joe had loved, Mary spoke the words that had become her daily prayer. "When you get to my age, every sunrise is a blessing." She was only 47, but she'd learned that wisdom had nothing to do with years. It came from understanding that family wasn't about blood. It was about choice, sacrifice, and the willingness to love without condition. In the gathering darkness, as the bears maintained their vigil around Joe's memorial, Mary felt a peace she hadn't known since childhood. This was what her grandfather had tried to teach her about the old ways, that all beings were connected, that love could transcend every boundary humans created, and that sometimes the most profound truths came from the most unexpected teachers. The story of Joe Whitehorse and Old Mother had become legend, but its deepest truth was simple. In a world that often seemed divided by fear and greed, love remained the most powerful force of all. At 63, Joe Whitehorse thought his story was ending. Widowed, childless, facing a terminal diagnosis with no family to comfort his final days. Like so many of us who've reached our golden years, he felt invisible, forgotten, convinced that his best chapters were behind him. But sometimes life writes the most beautiful endings when we least expect them. Joe discovered that family isn't about DNA or bloodlines. It's about who shows up when you need them most, who chooses to love you unconditionally. When Old Mother and her bear family formed that protective circle around his unconscious body, they weren't just saving his life. They were teaching us that connection, purpose, and belonging can come from the most unexpected places. Joe's final act wasn't one of defeat, but of fierce protection for those he loved. His legacy reminds us that even when we feel our usefulness has passed, we still have love to give, wisdom to share, and families to nurture, whether they have 2 legs or 4. Every sunrise remains a blessing because every day offers new opportunities to matter, to connect, to be someone's guardian angel. What unexpected connections have brought meaning to your later years? Have you ever found family in places you never imagined? Share your story below. We'd love to hear how love has surprised you too.